Let's move on now to yet another example of the national broadcaster not wanting to tell you an inconvenient truth. And credit to ABC Media Watch host Paul Barry for pointing it out this week.
For more than 30 years, London's world-leading Tavistock clinic has pioneered the treatment of children with gender dysphoria. But in recent years, it's been under mounting pressure, both from a surge in demand and from growing controversy. 2 years ago, the BBC revealed staff concerns about the clinic's haste in offering gender affirmation treatment. And 2 weeks ago, UK health authorities closed the gender clinic down.
As Barry said, the closure of Tavistock was a significant development. It was picked up by The Australian, Crikey, The Guardian and others. But guess who didn't consider it worthy of reporting?
But 2 weeks on, we can't see any trace of the story on the ABC. Not on its news bulletins or across its many TV, radio and online platforms. So we asked the ABC why the closure of the London clinic and the debate around gender dysphoria treatment was seemingly of no interest. It told us,
the focus of our coverage is what is happening in Australia, and Australian practices differ significantly to those that were in Tavistock. The change in Britain's model could certainly form part of future coverage where it's relevant.
Well, we believe it is relevant now, and if the ABC is convinced it's not, perhaps it should run an article explaining why that is so.
Well, several days later, and we are still yet to see that article. However, we did notice that ABC radio presenter Josh Sepps, who broadcast a segment on why the clinic was shut down, well, he wrote this on Twitter. I wanted to do this story weeks ago, and it was a useful reminder of the peril of journalists getting caught in groupthink. Now, Josh is a rare example of an ABC journalist who despises groupthink over journalistic integrity. And he deserves a lot of credit for pushing back against the narrative that this issue cannot be touched. However, not all ABC journos were as grateful to Paul Barry for pointing out their failures. We did notice that RM Breakfast executive producer Julia Holman tweeted, I don't see why Media Watch thinks the ABC News has failed by not covering the news that a London clinic treating young people with gender dysphoria has closed down. I'd rather hear about what's happening here, rather than a clinic on the other side of the world. Well, what a patronising and dishonest attempt to deflect. If RN Breakfast focuses on Australian-based topics without examining relevant developments overseas, then how does she explain this earlier in the month?
As Australia prepares to go to a referendum to enshrine a voice in the Constitution for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, what lessons can be learned from countries that have embarked on similar journeys?
And as Bernard Lane of The Australian tweeted in response to Holman, Australia's biggest gender clinic said of the UK Tavistock closure, we will continue to closely monitor how services nationally and internationally develop and evolve. Why is the global dimension obvious to hospital managers and not ABC News? We know the answer to that. ABC ethos holds that gender affirmation is an immutable truth. When you have children as young as 10 being pushed into taking puberty blockers who then grow up to regret that life-altering treatment, you have a problem. And that problem is made far worse by journalists who don't have the courage to ask questions. Daisy Cousins, very interested to hear your thoughts on this. It's an important story. I do firmly believe the ABC is on the wrong side of history here. Very interesting to see Media Watch take, I think, the correct stance in this situation.
Well, there's a saying, Jack, about broken clocks being right twice a day. And I think in this situation, Paul Barry is that broken clock who is right for the first or second time in a day. I actually thought he did a terrific job on this. It was extremely thorough and very, very honest. And it is fascinating to me that the ABC chose not to cover this story when, as Paul Barry pointed out in the full thing, they have covered a number of stories about trans kids in the past, because aside from the fact that it's, I think, obviously ideological. As you said, the ABC holds gender affirmation as an immutable truth. It's also a shame they didn't cover it, because take the ideology away, it's a fascinating story, the closure of the Tavistock Clinic. I mean, it's been around for years. There's arguments on both sides as to why it didn't close. There's the issue of the massive increase of demand. There are people who say that, well, look, maybe more kids are comfortable now coming out as trans because of changing social attitudes. There's another argument that there's a social contagion issue involved, which are all very objectively interesting, I would have thought, from a journalistic point of view. And on top of that, Jack, it looks like Tavistock is in danger of being sued by 1,000 families for pushing this gender ideology and treatment onto their kids. I mean, what about that is not interesting? What about that is not spine-tingling as a journalist and also as a reader? What about that is not valuable to read? So the ABC has just completely shot itself in the foot, I think, from a journalistic perspective in not covering it. And from an ideological perspective, it's just obvious they will not touch the trans narrative unless it is firmly the way they want it to be perceived.
Definitely. It's newsworthy because we do similar treatments here in Australia. It's as simple as that. Sophie, I'm hesitant to give Paul Barry too much credit, though, because I know that he has been all over the place on this issue. He's actually done editorials criticising The Australian for quite robust coverage of this issue. So I'm not quite sure what's happened, whether the latest news about Tavistock has changed his mind or whether he's just a little bit all over the place.
Well, Jack, it's quite rare that Paul Barry takes the ABC to task on their coverage of stories. So he did on this occasion, and I think it's important that the ABC is held to account by Media Watch and outlets, other media outlets. But this is an important issue. They do run a lot of stories in this space, Jack. And for the RN Breakfast executive producer to simply dismiss this entire story by saying it's overseas and I'm really not interested is absolutely absurd. I mean, if we adopted that approach all the time, we're just going to live in a little cocoon here in Australia. I think it's incredibly relevant. I think media outlets here should cover this story, and it could have implications back here in Australia, as you saw from that comment made with this type of therapy that is available in Australia. So it can have implications. So I think it's important that they are held to account because they seem to have at the public broadcaster a narrative on this topic, and that is in favour of this type of therapy. And I think that's problematic. The public broadcaster, Jack, should not have a narrative. They should cover all sides of the equation. And here they've completely missed the mark. So I think it's good that they've been called out on it.